Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to AAJA-Asia's digital salons covering the Israel-Hamas war, in practicality and its situations. And before we start the event, we would like to introduce some ground rules and house rules of AAJA-Asia. So I would just like to share my screen for the code of conduct, and please wait just a minute. Okay, so Paloma, you can just yeah see this screen if you can, and try
Yeah,
to yeah read this to the participants.
perfect. Hello. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Paloma Almoguera. I'm a Southeast Asia correspondent for EFE, the Spanish News Agency. It's my pleasure to be here helping to moderate this very important and interesting panel. Just as a reminder, this house rules, code of conduct, please be sure to mute yourself and turn your camera off during the presentation, unless you are one of the speakers. Ask questions by posting them in the chat box. And please enjoy this panel with us. May I proceed with the introduction of our speakers, if that's
Can we
okay?
close the screen share?
Perfect.
Yeah, okay. There we go. We can see each other. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this panel. I would like to introduce the speakers we have today from different parts of the world. We have from Hong Kong, Eric Wishart. He is the Standards and Ethics Editor and former Editor-in-Chief of the International News Agency, AFP. From Australia, but previously in Gaza, we have Nicole Johnson, covers Australia for Sky UK and was reporting on Gaza for ABC Australia. In Israel now, in Tel Aviv, Rami Inocencio, he's the CBS News foreign correspondent. And from Australia as well, we have Tony Loughran, a global risk specialist with more than 30 years of international experience. And also he just published a new book, Zero Risk, about his life and work in conflict zones. Congratulations for that, Tony. As we have Rami, who has traveled to Israel recently, perhaps we can start with him from the ground. We just wake up here in Singapore with this terrible news. Another Israel military expanding ground operations in Gaza. So perhaps Rami, you can let us know how you are living the situation from there.
Great. Thanks very much, Paloma. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this AAJA-Asia panel. It's nice to be with you all and with speakers here. Right now, it's just a couple minutes past 6 a.m., so apologies if I'm just getting my coffee up and running here on this side of the world. The situation here has just changed quite dramatically in just the past few hours, actually. So this panel comes quite at a good time. About 12 hours ago or so, Israel started a major campaign going into the Gaza Strip. According to CBS News and our national security correspondent, a rolling ground invasion of Gaza has begun. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, if you've been following, had already pledged that there would be a ground invasion after the October 7th attacks exactly 3 weeks ago today. The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, said that a ground invasion isn't happening, but with that said, everyone else thinks it is happening. So it's also a matter of perspective and what people are saying, what people aren't saying. But media reports and coming out of Palestinian media say that a ground invasion has happened. Jordan's foreign minister says the ground invasion has happened, and we're hearing out of the United States, as I said, that it looks like it has happened. So a lot of the media are likely going down to the south. It's only about an hour from Tel Aviv down to the Gaza-Israel border. Last night there were continued air raid sirens across much of the country here, with rockets being fired from Hamas coming into Israel. But with that said, there were even more barrages. And now, as far as I know from the last reporting from 4 hours ago, all of Gaza has no electricity, no communications, no power. The skyline shots that we're seeing, total blackness, total darkness there. But it's also, while it's blinded Hamas, it's also blinded the population there, which is more than 2 million people, 2.3 million people, about half of which is under 18, a massive youth population there. So there's a massive humanitarian crisis. So to recap, it's a lot of tension. There's this fog of war. Not sure what's really happening. But that's the reason why I myself, in a couple hours, and again, most of the media here probably are headed down south to see for ourselves and to be reporting from there. So over this weekend and over the next week, you'll probably see more reports. And while there had been a lull over the past few days with other things happening in the news, we'll probably see the Israel-Hamas war come back to the front lines.
I mean, as you said, I mean, it's even harder to know what is really happening, and the intention is going to the south. What do you think is going to be possible to see from there? You can share your, like your thoughts, Rami, and also perhaps Nicole, because you know well the area as well.
Sure. So the towns there, the biggest town is the town of Sderot, and at its closest point to the Gaza-Israel border, it's only about 1 kilometer away. We were down there yesterday filming, and we saw plumes of smoke, black smoke rising, coming from the Gaza Strip, while Israeli artillery was firing on, pounding the northern part of the strip. My cameraman was doing some geolocation, and he believes that it was a refugee camp that was being hit, the Al-Shati refugee camp. Now, I need to caveat that by saying that the Israeli military may have been hitting that. However, it's very well known that Hamas uses civilian institutions, buildings, areas to hide entrances to a massive tunnel network that's under Gaza, up to 300 miles long, maybe even more, according to estimates. It's a massive underground city. And again, if you've been following, you'll know that the hostages that have been taken are likely there. It's one of the strengths. It's maybe the biggest strength of Hamas down there. So a lot of small kibbutzim. What's the plural for kibbutzes? These are collective communities down there. Many of those were attacked in the October 7th events. Sderot is again the biggest town. So what we'll probably see, plumes of smoke. We'll likely hear a lot more than we'll see, though, to your question, Paloma. Yesterday when we were there, we heard the screeching of warplanes overhead. Our military security guy who is attached with us, he told us at various times, he was like, hold on, guys, you hear that? That's those are jet planes. Just wait for a second, and don't feel the need to jump. And then sure enough, 2 or 3 or 4 seconds later, you hear the, and then boom. And that was Gaza getting pounded. We also heard the whine of drones overhead. So those drones were likely helping to be eyes on the ground to target artillery. And then every few minutes or so, you'd hear a soft boom, which usually is Gaza getting hit by a round of artillery. But if it's a sharper crack, like lightning closer to us, then that was likely the artillery coming from just over the hill from us. So yeah, it's the situation is very tense. This is a war footing. And for me, I'm new to Israel in this sense. It's probably the most intense that I've ever been in. I've done Ukraine 4 rotations, and there's a low hum of anxiety, but here the anxiety is ratcheted up much higher. But with that said, it seems a lot of people, many people, and I think maybe Nicole, you can speak to this more since you've lived in this region, that people are more used to it and normalized. But the caveat there, the qualifier, is that this normal, for most people, for people here attending, it will not be normal. And for all intents and purposes, it shouldn't be normal, but this is normal for here.
Nicole, you you covered the 2012 and 2014 Gaza wars, and also perhaps you can share your experience, the difference between then and now, and also your experience as reporting for Al Jazeera and reporting for this is Sky and ABC now. Please.
Sure. Yeah. So just briefly for background, I lived in Gaza for 12 months. In 2011, at that stage, I was the only Western journalist based in Gaza. Jazeera always had a big emphasis on having a Western journalist, not that I like the distinction of Western, non-Western, inside Gaza, purely for what we're seeing now. So in the 2008-2009 war, by sheer luck, coincidence, Ayman Mohadeen and Shireen Tadros from Jazeera happened to be in Gaza. Ayman was based down there when that war broke out. And when it broke out, they were the only Western journalists based in Gaza. And from that time on, Jazeera made sure that they had someone always permanently there, because you never knew, as has turned out to be the case, when Gaza would explode. So I think ordinarily, as Rami said, people don't go into Gaza for stories. They go in every now and then when there's a war. 2012, 2014, and then what was the last one? 2021. It's almost difficult to keep up. It's practically every couple of years. Up until this one, Israel had, except for 2008, 2009, had been allowing journalists to report from inside Gaza. And I think it was obviously part of their, look at us, we're the most moral army in the world, and, wanting to show their sort of targeted attacks. And foreign journalists were able to cross through Erez Crossing, be based in Deira Hotel, and operate in Gaza. So what we're seeing now is absolutely extraordinary on so many levels, but perhaps from a journalistic point of view, the fact that nobody is in there. And I think that, among many things, aside from the death toll of 7,000 plus people and 2,000 children, is the real tragedy in this. All of these journalists will be based down on the border of southern Israel, and it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one for Rami and for all of them, because what can you see? What can you hear? That's about it. You'll see the tanks and the APCs and perhaps the bulldozers rolling in, and you end up getting a very, in my opinion, and I'm coming from a 10-year Jazeera based in the Middle East, global South view of the world, I think a very Israeli perspective side of the story. And I think it is starting to change a bit now. Different networks are trying to get Palestinian voices out of Gaza. Well, that may be nigh impossible now that the communication appears to have been cut entirely. But, unless you either have correspondence, local correspondence, as Reuters, Jazeera, various networks do, based on the ground with an ability to get those pictures out, or people, I mean, for me, I lived there for a year, so I can ring up people when the communication works in Gaza and say, what's happening? Tell me some stories. What are you doing? How are you looking after your children? Are you getting food? But unless you know people in Gaza or have made those contacts, then it ends up, from what I've been watching from a lot of broadcasters, certainly not all, being IDF says this, Israeli troops are saying this, I spoke to this commander, I spoke to that commander, and we're not hearing so much of the Palestinian perspective, to the extent that I think it becomes, so many sort of heartbreaking stories, as there should be, of, the hostage taking and the families in Israel, because they were there and they were accessible stories to get to. But on the Palestinian side, it becomes the UN, and it becomes a death toll. And there are less of those stories out there. They're harder to get, but I think that's the real challenge for journalists, to get those voices, especially now that, let's say, the death toll now is on the Gaza Palestinian side. So there's a real imperative as a journalist to get those stories out, to make those contacts and connections, to get the voice notes, to humanize that side of the story. And right now that's become almost impossible because A, you can't get in, and now it seems that there's no communication to get those messages out.
Mm-hmm. Eric, correct me if I'm wrong. I think AFP has correspondent now moved to Rafah, if that's correct. I know F as well. My agency is moving.
Yeah, we've got about 9.
It's moving to the south. Perhaps you can let us know how are they working from there? Yeah.
Very difficult, and just overnight. I mean, Nicole said they cut off the communications, so they're actually trying to pick up networks from Israeli networks, and the living conditions are extremely difficult. Some nights have slept outside. Family members killed, friends and family members killed. Photographers shooting victims being dug out of rubble and discovering that they're actually people they know. Extremely difficult. We actually, AFP and Reuters wrote to the Israelis just yesterday, the day before, asking them to guarantee the safety of the journalists. And the reply was that the IDF is targeting all Hamas military activity throughout Gaza in the vicinity. And they said that Hamas deliberately put military operations in the vicinity of journalists and civilians, right? And so they said they could, under these circumstances, we cannot guarantee your employees' safety and strongly urge you to take all necessary measures for their safety. Well, the necessary measures were supposed to be going down south, but I mean, there's been shelling there. So obviously, safety is our top concern. I mean, I would also support what Rami said. I mean, I've been in AFP almost 40 years. I've never seen anything as kind of polarizing and extreme as this conflict. It's causing a lot of tension in newsrooms, and it's a very tough coverage. And also, and Tony can speak to this on the safety side. 2 weeks ago, we had a team in South Lebanon. You know, for people who are not familiar with the way it works on the ground, we do work together as journalists. So Al Jazeera, Reuters, AP, and AFP were all together in a group in South Lebanon and got shelled. The journalists who were there said the shelling came from the Israeli side. And there was a Reuters journalist, Issam Abdullah, was killed, and 2 AFP journalists were wounded. So the safety aspect is a real concern from us, and also the mental health aspect. I mean, I go through my job basically every morning. From when I get up, I go through all the production, photo, video, and text, and then I kind of do a mini report for the editor-in-chief when they come into Paris in the afternoon my time about the coverage, point stuff out. We're constantly updating the guidelines, and I've never seen so many dead babies and children in my life. I mean, it's just. I mean, they call you. I mean, can send you the raw production of the AFP from Gaza. It's absolutely horrendous. I mean, it's obviously horrendous. It's what happened in the kibbutz, but it's a real mental toll. I mean, we have a small number of people on the ground, but a lot of people processing this content. Really, really tough, you know. And I saw an image of what happened to my Christina Assis, the AFP photographer's leg. You know, it's one of these, I can't unsee that situation. So there's a real mental health problem for everybody involved. Plus, it's very polarizing. You know, there's a real, if you're not for us, you're against this situation. A lot of children, a lot of dead kids on both sides. Horrible story in the AFP and last night about an Israeli officer saying he'd seen a beheaded baby, you know. So it's taken a very tough mental toll as well.
I just want to chime in.
Good luck, Rami. Take care. Right?
Thanks, Eric. I just want to say, Eric, to you and to all agencies who are there, most of us wouldn't be able to do our work in television were it not for organizations like yours, AFP, AP, Reuters, to show us what is on the ground there. I can only start to imagine the horrors that your teams, your staff there are seeing, because what we see through the screen already removes some connection to it but when they see it with their own eyes or through their lenses, I mean, I've gotten emotional just looking at it, and there's some things that I will not be able to unsee. And I can only imagine it'll just be so much more tough down there. So thank you for all that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Tony, you can give us, please, your opinion and your experience about safety, and what do you think, like what could be done in this conflict that unfortunately we think is going to only to get more and more challenging to protect the journalists who are covering it.
Yeah, thank you, Paloma, and it's great to be in the company of all the particular panelists here. I actually kind of started the first hostile environments course off, back in the 1995, and we recognized just exactly where the problems were. We were training people up on first aid and not doing the hostile environments training. And what we did, it was a game changer. And so for many years, this was offered to staff, but it wasn't offered to freelancers. And that was the big kind of problem that we had, with covering conflict. 2003, I went into Nablus to investigate the death of Nazid Al-Wazi, who was a cameraman working for APTN. And I returned there 3 weeks ago in Nablus to meet up with the families and meet up with some of the regional journalists. And I'm sad to say that nothing's changed. I feel that some of the regional journalists themselves are not really being given the protection they need. They're not being given the training. And when I spoke to one of the guys who's running some of the journalist school in Nablus, what he told me was that basically these people themselves, the university courses are rolled out, but there's no particular element of hostile environments. And now this may sound strange to the panelists here, and also the people listening in, because you'd think at the end of the day that individuals themselves that are based there know exactly what the risks are. And in my investigation, I actually found it was quite bizarre. I found they didn't really know what to hide behind, what to do, protection, what was the best body armor they could have. And I'm still seeing images now on the Israeli side of it now, with the coverage of this anyway, with body armor that is really deficient. And it's kind of interesting. And there was a freelancer the other day, and it really kind of worried me. And he put up a GoFundMe scheme to get him a helmet and some body armor and a few other bits and pieces and a respirator. And I was just absolutely shocked, because people still want to report from there, and it's important they do. But like Rami said, the networks themselves are really behind everybody to actually give them that particular right stuff. I mean, my little visit to Nablus, I was sat on the balcony with Abed Cassini, who's the actual former Reuters guy, and Tracer zipped past us quite quickly. And there were 2 explosions where the IDF were coming in that night at 1 o'clock in the morning to make arrests on some of the Hamas positions in Nablus. And what was interesting for me was the locals just took it as read. That's fine. There's no problems at all. But I said to Abed, I said, look, do you realize how close these rounds were coming in? He's gone, no problem. So we have got an issue here. And I take on Nicole's position here. What a great thing to do is to actually be embedded there within these particular communities for so long. And what I found really when I was talking to the guys in the West Bank when I was there is a lot of the journalists weren't there. They were actually Western journalists. They were actually relying on some of the actual individuals to do this job. So what I did with AFP as well in Kabul is I recognized that when things happen like this in Israel, the medical teams are not going to come to you, okay? And most of the actual journalists themselves that I found in my investigations were dying from hypovolemic shock. They were losing blood very quickly when some people could have been saved. So what we did with AFP in Kabul, which I'd suggest would be the same in Israel, is the vehicles were turned into a type of ambulance, effectively, which was rigged with intravenous fluids, tourniquets, and everything else for that matter. And we trained everybody up in the AFP bureau in looking at airway management, looking at kind of intravenous infusion, and also casualty triaging as well. And that was really effective. And that was after the death of Marai, when simply what they would do was pile the bodies up one by one onto the actual truck. And a lot of the journalists themselves that were there covering some of the stories died of positional asphyxia. In other words, nobody really could get to them to actually try and help them out. So this journey for safety is being going on for many, many years, and it will continue. And I think at the end of the day, what is to come, and it may sound weird to the panel, but all of my particular investigations, a lot of it has been around the tactical extraction or the finish of the conflict when there's a withdrawal. And that is also a really volatile time for journalists, because you don't even know what you're dealing with when you're walking in and out of these situations, whether things have been booby-trapped or whatever. So that's just my contribution at this particular stage.
What about mental health, Tony?
Yeah, look, it was very much overlooked. It was when I was in the forces as well years ago. It was seen as just something, yeah, you can deal with it. But what's interesting for me, when I was in Jenin a couple of weeks ago, there was a woman came out with her baby, and the baby was just staring at the sky, and the baby was kind of catatonic, and it had witnessed just the most amazing kind of horrible things anyway as a young kid. And the journalists themselves, okay, they actually kind of absorb all of this. This is what I'm seeing, and this is what I've experienced in anyway my 30 years on the ground. And the problem is that unless a network has got something really good in place to do kind of personal debriefing and group debriefing as well, you'll walk away from the conflict, and what will happen is the images will stay within you, and you will walk into the next conflict, and it's that champagne moment where everything builds up. And I've had it before, so I know exactly how it feels. But group debriefing is so important for networks, and the right debriefer as well, because some people in the past, Kate Adie and a couple of other people from years ago, the BBC, threw their debriefers out, threw their particular psychologists out, because at the end of the day, they didn't really understand journalism. They didn't understand that you have to be there to get those images, to get that story. So again, networks themselves should be really, consistent really with getting people to do this.
Tony, if you don't mind me chiming in, you talked about something about a champagne moment. What happens in that, or if you're okay to share it with you, like what happened?
I had, it's a personal account, and I know it goes on elsewhere, because when I debriefed some of the BBC journalists coming back from Bosnia, you get a layer, Rami, you get an exposure, okay, like a camera exposure to an incident. Mm-hmm. That one stays in the bottle. Then you get another one on top of that, and another one, and another one. And it's a triggered moment in time that actually manages to kind of explode this bottle. My one in particular, it wasn't to do with a war zone. I actually had a burglar in my house in London, and I had a huge fight to arrest this guy. And all of a sudden, I had complete flashbacks to everything I'd been doing in my military career, and also in my journalistic kind of exposure with the BBC as well. So it was just this one horrible moment where you ended up in meltdown. And if you don't debrief, you end up with that compression effect of your thoughts and your memories as well.
On that point, speaking to some of the journalist colleagues, old friends of mine in Gaza over the last few days, I mean, from my experience, they've never had any debriefing. They might be staff, they might be on a retainer, they have different relationships with different networks. Often in a war situation, they'll work for 10 networks at once and make hay while the sun shines. That's the wrong expression, but they know it's a rare opportunity, that it's not an opportunity at all, but they have to do their job. But I have never heard them so broken. And these are, very tough, very 30-year Gaza veterans with 9 children saying to you, I'm waiting to be next in line to die. I don't know what to say to my children. I've moved them 10 times. And it is just absolutely heartbreaking conversations. And I think we can't not mention the deaths of the Al Jazeera Arabic bureau chief, Wael Dadoa, lost his wife, 2 children and a grandchild. I mean, pretty extraordinary, certainly, Al Jazeera Arabic style, in that his whole visit to the morgue was on air, live. I interviewed a friend of mine who's one of his best friends. I mean, we're all at Jazeera, so I know all of these people. And yeah, I mean, pretty tough stuff. Like, you feel terribly guilty ringing these people up and going, hey, Sammy, what to say, right? Can we chat for a few minutes? What happened? How is Wael? What's going down? But you do feel like it's the only thing you can do is try and get these voices out. I mean, albeit from the, you know, absolute luxury and comfort of living in Sydney, Australia. But yeah, I don't know how these guys are going to get through it. And you know, these are pretty, relative to most people in Gaza, well off. They have money, they have ordinarily resources, but right now they're in the same situation as everybody else. Nowhere's safe. They moved from the north to the south, and their house was still struck. So while Del Doa, he's back on air. Obviously, he's in, I mean, who would know? I can only imagine complete and utter shock, but continuing to work right now is the only thing that he can do. And he just continued on air, having lost his wife and 2 children. So, yeah, this is what's happening, as we know.
I found one of the investigations I did years ago was John Schofield's death in Bosnia. And I actually found that this might help the team out. Okay, this is going to happen later on down the track. But we actually took some of the people back that were affected by the actual attack itself in Croatia on the BBC truck or the vehicle. We took them back to the scene of the crime, literally a couple of years later. And all of them said that it was one of the best things they ever did, because they were really feeling guilty, every single one of them, about whether someone was pushing the envelope a little bit to actually get more of a shot, more of a story. Someone was saying, let's pull out, and they ignored him, you know. And it was a really interesting thing where this one action that we did proved invaluable. And I just implore really the networks themselves working over there to recognize this mental health, because it's such a damaging thing that once you finish the conflict, okay, it doesn't go away. It's still played out in your brain, you know, for image after image after image. And for me, it was smells. So I was getting flashbacks to smells, whether it's diesel on the floor or blood. And from my point of view, that was something else that triggered for me. I needed help. Okay, so I think it's important we have that help for everybody, and the freelancers included as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'll chime in with that and say that I'm thankful that I work for a large organization as CBS News. My prior organization, Bloomberg TV, also had resources for this kind of mental wellness here. Thankfully, our head of HR in Washington, D.C. often reaches out and says thank you, and if you have anything, that we have resources available. The flip side of it is that a lot of journalists are strong, and sometimes maybe they think they're too strong, and that it's also incumbent on all of us here watching and talking that you have to self-identify and say, okay, I think I need to talk to someone, because there are a lot of colleagues, I suppose, maybe not a lot, but some colleagues that I know say, oh, you know, just brush it off, make a joke, maybe make not a funny joke, but for some reason journalists have, you know, we have wry senses of humor, and you sort of just soldier on. But I'm thankful, Tony, that you're on this panel to talk about that mental health issue and the risks there are. So to anyone here who is considering going into war reporting, or who is a war reporter, just it starts with you as well to say, hey, I need to talk to someone.
Yep. Sorry, jumping in with a question before we move to other topics. Fortunately, large organizations like yours, Rami, like I feel like mine as well. I mean, mental health is becoming more and more important, more training, more resources, safety, more training. But what about the freelancers? I don't know if in this conflict in particular, are you seeing more freelancers as well on the ground? Because that was something that has been happening in Ukraine, for example. Are you seeing that from the ground, and what kind of help could they have these days? Tony, also you can comment on this in both things, in mental health and safety and trainings beforehand.
Yeah, if I might just circle back to the institutions I saw anyway, some of the actual local institutions, and newsrooms and agencies as well. I felt that they really wanted help. They knew that the actual storm was coming. They really did, you know, and I sensed it as well when I was there in a couple of weeks ago. But what's happened is that the likes of the universities and so on and so forth, which I keep coming back to, are sponsoring the locals themselves to become journalists And there's so many of them now being flooded into the market as freelancers. But they're young kids. And a lot of the time, they don't have the support or the experience in some respects, but they actually still want to cut their teeth on any particular story. And I think it's remiss, really, of the networks to figure out just exactly how they can support them. Years ago, we actually started the first ever insurance program for freelancers. There was no insurance at all for any one of them going into some of the war zones. So we went to Lloyd's of London and we actually got this particular policy underwritten. Now, the thing is, what they need now, they really need good hostile environments training. And we're pushing with the IFJ and everybody else to push that into the West Bank at the moment now. I mean, obviously, there's a lull because of a horrible lull, but that's so desperately needed for the people that are in there, because they just don't simply gauge what's going on. And I'll give you one example, and Rami, you might actually, and Nicole as well, attest to this. One of my investigations that I did in the West Bank was interesting, because what the Israelis were doing, they were targeting journalists by bouncing rounds round the corner. They were using the walls to actually shoot into the press pack. Okay, and it's simple things like that that can get people killed if they don't really understand the situation, what's going on from a hostile environments course. They're actually going to put themselves in jeopardy. So there's things like this that we've learned along the way. And sadly, the Al Jazeera chap, I can't remember his name now, in Syria, took a round to the gut because it was bounced off 2 walls and into the floor and into his gut. And that was the investigation that we did. So training is desperately needed, equipment's needed, and medical kit as well, including things like your brand new bandages now, like the Israeli bandage that we've actually got now with a clotting mechanism in place to try and help out and assist with these individuals, because it is so vital they get the best kit and they get the best body armor nowadays as well, which at the end of the day is made of a very lightweight fabric called Dyneema. Problem is with some of the journalists themselves, forgive me for saying this, but some of the guys, the locals themselves, were literally throwing their body armor away because it was too heavy or it was really old and it actually kind of been shot to pieces. And one example we can give you, Tom Cook, Australian journalist, went out to Israel quite a few years ago, got shot in the chest, and the round itself actually smashed the plate, and the plate itself caused the damage, not the bullet, into his body. Okay, so it's things like that that I've investigated a long time, and we've got the results of what we need to do to make these particular freelancers safe.
I can talk about freelancers as well, Paloma. I mean, when I was editor-in-chief of AFP, we introduced mandatory hostile environment training around the time of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So you're looking at 2001, 2, 3. And then Tony started working with us. And we, regarding freelancers, we train our permanent freelancers, and we brought them to Hong Kong. And Tony, you've trained our Afghan freelancers, at least one of whom was killed in Kabul, because you can't always, no matter how much training, you can't legislate for gunmen walking into a hotel on a Friday night and shooting the correspondent, the wife, and his 3 kids sitting at a dinner table, or a big danger is always with explosions, as secondary explosions. And Shamarai, that Tony referenced, was our chief photographer, and there was a bombing, and he went down to cover the aftermath, and there was an ISIS suicide bomber walked up to the group of journalists pretending to be a cameraman and killed Shamarai and I think 8 or 9 other journalists. So training does have its limits, but so we train our permanent freelancers. Tony's come to Hong Kong to do the training here. James Foley worked for us. He worked for us in Libya, if you know the name. He was killed by ISIS. He then worked for us as a freelance in Syria, was kidnapped, and 2 years later was killed on camera by ISIS, at which point we stopped. We introduced a rule at AFP. We would no longer take material contributions from freelancers in areas that AFP wouldn't go to. And they got some kickback from freelancers who said it's not up to AFP to decide what we do. But I mean, I can say if it's too dangerous for AFP, Reuters, AP, you shouldn't be there. And we also, around that time, the DART Center for Journalism Trauma, which is based at the Columbia School of Journalism in New York, drew up a set of safety principles for freelance journalists. They now call themselves the AAJA Alliance, creating a culture of safety for journalism. And we're all signatories, many major news and smaller news organizations are signatories. And apart from that, don't send freelancers places you wouldn't send your own staff. It does go into training and also insurance, which is something actually that's probably not as kind of headline grabbing as safety and, learning first aid and all the rest of it. But so many freelancers go in uninsured, and the medical consequences if you get injured, and medical bills for the rest of your life. So, but that's one thing if you're freelancing for a big news organization. And what always scares me in these conflicts, it's a bit different regarding Gaza, because you can't get into Gaza, but the cost of being a freelance in a war zone has come right down. Armed with a laptop and a phone, basically you can report from anywhere. So a lot of the reason that so many freelancers go into these danger zones and die or get kidnapped or wounded is because they can take images, they can transmit if they get an internet connection, but they just don't have the training and they don't have the backup of an AFP or a Tony Blockman. So freelancers are a constant concern.
Can I just add to that, Eric, as well? As it's interesting on this one, folks, is that I was criticised years ago from the BBC point of view because they thought at the end of the day that all we need is first aid training. And I was saying, no, you need a proactive course that can recognise where the risks are, whether it's a kind of a TMA-2 mine that's positioned, whether it's a car bomb, whether it's a sticky bomb, which is what I started looking at in Afghanistan. And in the course of writing my book, I actually started to reach out to some of the freelancers and ask them, and I hadn't seen these guys for 10 to 15 years. Did you enjoy the course 15 years ago? Have you put it to good use? Now, the first 6 pages of the book are filled with testaments from the individuals where it saved their lives. And I was shocked. I was really, really shocked in the course of writing this and researching my book that it really was effective. But as you said, Eric, you can't legislate for everything. There's always going to be something somewhere that's going to happen. But you have to really limit the amount of kind of exposure that you have got and take heed from people like the security people that you've actually got, Rami, at the moment. And same with Nicole when you were obviously in there, and get the right advice and just don't go in blindly. That's the big thing really for me.
Nicole and Rami, perhaps you can share your experience. Nicole, you've been in Gaza for a long time. Rami, you have just arrived, if we may say, to Israel. How has your training been in both cases, and how important has been for you, Nicole, previous experiences to know a little bit more what to expect and how to prepare yourself?
Gosh, it's a difficult one to answer. I mean, obviously we had the hostile environment training. It was a different war as well, to the point that you said before that I didn't quite answer, which is how is this war different? And speaking to my old colleagues on the ground, they say, Nicole, it is like nothing else. It's not like 2012. It's not like 2014, where, of course, there's always a risk, but to a certain extent, you felt as though it was a manageable risk. So even though you were inside Gaza for those wars, all the journalists tended to stay in 2 hotels. Of course, the IDF knew where those hotels were, and you had a sense of security that you were probably going to be okay there. Now, then we worked from the Al Jazeera Bureau, which was, I'm sure, targeted. It was targeted at various times over various wars, but there was a modicum of a sense of safety that you had, that if they were going to target it, they'd probably call up first, because the IDF in previous wars has had a policy that the Palestinians used to call the knock on the door policy, whereby they would get a call from the IDF before their house was bombed. And one of the things that sort of my old colleagues are saying about all of the risks that they're going through now is, of course, there are no calls. You know, it could happen any time, any day, and it's not just one house. It's not just one building or one street. It's entire neighborhoods have been flattened, as we know. I mean, I think in terms of, previous wars, I was in Mosul and Sirte for those, for the campaigns for both of those against ISIS. And yeah, I don't know. God, it's a hard one to say. I mean, even there, you felt like you knew where the front line was and you could go up to a certain point. And I'm pretty cautious. If I went up to the front line, I'd kind of try to go up there and knock it over in half an hour and then get back. And I often found you could get just as good a material a couple of streets back, or even half an hour out on the outskirts where the, internally displaced people are fleeing from. From what my old Gazan friends are saying in there, they feel that nowhere is safe. There's nothing that they can do. They could have all the training in the world from Tony, and right now it would not make any difference. That's what they're saying. I mean, it's just incredibly, difficult, heartbreaking sort of testaments to be hearing from people. I also noticed, just slightly off topic, one of the messages that came through talking about Queen Rania of Jordan and the double standards in Western reporting, as she claimed or brought out or said. That might be something that we could talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is a really interesting one. I think a lot of the language from a lot of networks, certainly on the Israeli perspective, immediately after the attack in Israel, of course, was, atrocities, carnage, rampage, horror, all of which is true. I find, and I'd be interested to hear what Eric has to say on it as well. When it comes to Gaza, you don't hear that loaded language. I think that, the language should be fairly consistent on both sides. We either use it or we don't use it. But on the Palestinian side, I find it much more, numbers, facts, and you don't get a sense so much. And as I said, that may be starting to change of, the horror of the situation on that side of the border right now.
I mean, if you read the AFP coverage, you will see it. I mean, we've got endless eyewitness accounts, but as you say, not everybody has that access. So, and plus the photo and video coverage is just horrific, and I followed ISIS coverage from Syria and Iraq. So my pain threshold is quite high when it comes to horrific. And it's sustained. So, but language, yeah, if we move on to language, we just updated our guidelines this week. It just shows you how intense this is. I mean, my job, if there's a war or some event happens, you'll update your guidelines. But this is every single word. And this was discussed with the Middle East region, with Jerusalem. Every word is weighed. How do you describe Hamas? For a start, we don't spare the language. The horror of what happened to the Israelis and the Palestinians, we describe equally graphically. We had a report from a mortuary where they're trying to identify the Israeli dead from October the 7th, and likewise we report from the hospitals and bombed buildings in Gaza. But language, of course, there was the attack on the hospital a week ago, which was a very classic journalistic problem. Hamas said that an Israeli airstrike hit this hospital and killed 500 people. So I think just about every single media said, Israeli airstrike hits hospital, kills 500 people, Hamas says. And that was the problem. So I think everybody, and then the Israelis came out and they said, well, actually, I saw the briefing. It was Islamic Jihad, I think they said, were firing rockets which were going over the hospital, and one misfired landed in the car park. The Israeli spokesman also said if it had been an Israeli bomb, basically there wouldn't have been any hospital left. So, but what we've done, and I think what other news organizations are doing, which is put the source first. Hamas says Israel did this. Israel says we didn't, or we're investigating. Likewise, Israel said Hamas did this. So you're reporting the same facts, but the old journalistic rule is you're supposed to put the facts first, then the source. It's just an easier read. You got to change that in the conflict. And I'll raise the elephant in the room. I think there's this elephant in the room, and I've been involved in a couple of discussions about this in other panels, is the use of the word terrorist. And I think there's a lot of misframing about the use of the word, or the lack of the use of the word terrorist. I mean, I saw a headline, AFP tells its reporters not to call Hamas terrorists. What the headline really should be is AP, AFP, Reuters, the BBC, and many other news organizations never call anybody a terrorist. And they continue to apply it in this war. I mean, that's the rule. I think newspapers can have their political biases, bents, whatever, and choose the language they want. But a public broadcaster like the BBC or an international news agency like AFP, I think our roles are to put the information out there and let other people decide. We certainly will use the word terrorist with attribution. We will say that an organization has been designated as terrorist by United States, UK, EU, Israel, you name it. But we're not in the business of putting labels and things. But I think some people might think that this was a rule that was created specifically for Hamas in this conflict. Well, this is a long-standing rule. Any more than we would call a politician a liar, we would do a fact check to show that they weren't telling the truth. We wouldn't call them a liar. We don't call military governments regimes. We don't call, leaders of one-party states dictators. I mean, we're just not in the business of putting labels on things, but we certainly don't hold back. News organizations who don't use that label terrorist without attribution certainly don't hold back in the coverage. I mean, the graphic coverage of what happened on October the 7th really speaks for itself without attaching labels on people that did it. But I think that I attended a meeting of the Organization of News Ombuds, no longer news ombudsmen and standards editors, a week ago, and of the 1 hour discussion, half an hour of it was discussed. We discussed the use of the word terrorist, so it's quite an issue.
And yeah, into that, we've actually had that discussion here, Eric, about fighters / militants / terrorists. When you brought that up, I nodded severely, because this is something, when you say, if a journalist says terrorist, or if someone says terrorist, it can more easily show their bias, their lean, and people, non-journalists, are allowed to have those opinions, right? But with attribution, what you said is important. So the times that I have said terrorist, then I say called so by, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or so-and-so, or government, right? Because governments can label organizations terrorists, but journalists ourselves don't label them terrorists. This conversation reminds me of what I saw, I believe, what was it? The Anti-Defamation League in the United States, the ADL, came on MSNBC, and the head of it, I believe, had basically criticized MSNBC and said, "Why don't you guys call them terrorists? Who is bankrolling you?" There's clearly high emotions running. However, it was very clear that there's this debate that has been happening and will still continue to happen on this. But it's important for us to make sure that we don't get in the middle of that. I think something earlier you said at the beginning, Eric, or maybe Nicole, is that this is very polarizing. So every word that we choose can decide whether you get attacked as a journalist, from whether it's one side or the other. And in this unfortunate age where we as journalists are more easily attacked by anyone and everyone, from politicians to trolls on Twitter or Instagram, it's even more important for us to watch every word, to check it with a colleague, a producer, or an editor to say, hey, I've written this, or, this is a tweet that I want to send out. This is a script that I have. you can trust yourself, but also trust someone else to be a second pair of eyes.
We
Tweets,
advise,
for example.
sorry, Paloma, just a quick one.
Oh, sorry, go
Actually,
on. We can.
No, I was just following on from what Rami said. We advised our staff not to post personal comments about this conflict online. And if they're going to post stuff in social media, keep it to AFP posts. Because as you just said, Rami, one wrong word and you can put a bureau at risk in a sensitive country, and you can just expose yourself to a ton of online abuse. I shared a video AFP did. We went back to the site of the rave a few days later, and we did just the usual, shoes and discarded whatever. And I shared the video online and immediately got whacked. Somebody said that it was actually half of the people killed were shot by the Israeli army, the AFP tells lies, etc., etc. So, I mean, so even the most banal, it wasn't that banal, but, I think anybody who's thinking about posting this online has got to know that even what you think might be quite a reasonable comment can just attract a tsunami of harassment. So, and to the extent there was a person, I think it was a journalist actually, somebody saw something they posted. It was in Europe or the UK, and somebody actually turned up at the door. I don't know if it was a pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, turned up at the door basically saying, how can you post this online? So you got to be careful if you are posting about this and you've got a strong view. Don't watch that your location can't be traced, because there's a risk element for everybody in this one. Nicole, sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just absolutely agreeing with you. I mean, it's the first time I've not posted anything. I've pretty much shut down all my social media, and I'm doing some sort of, on-set analysis at the ABC. So it's all, public broadcaster, all very straight down the line. And even still, people who have been able to get my email address, you start getting abuse, and it never happened to me at Jazeera. Maybe they thought there was no point because they were preaching to the converted or something, but it's a very different situation now, or in an Australian context also. The anger and passion that it's inflaming on both sides. So I think it seems a bit mad, but it is a fair point. You don't want people being able to contact you, and you certainly don't want them to know where you might be.
Mm-hmm.
No real-time
that you even have to think about that.
Yeah, no real-time location postings. I'll also say that because of recent coverage here, the interpretation of it, the coverage from CNN and BBC, the interpretation of it from various sides has actually gotten both organizations into hot water. And we were advised to make sure that when we're going around to say that we're not CNN or BBC, and to say that we are, a CBS network television channel and not a cable channel. So depending on what's been happening, it's unfortunate because we can be targets, and you can Google it up, but various reporters, correspondents from those organizations, particular CNN comes to mind, where people have been accosted, yelled at, to my knowledge, not physically, but when you're in a face-to-face argument or trying to extract yourself from it, it can get very heated and even worse very quickly.
I had to, just to chip in on that one there, Rami, I had to do a debrief on a journalist in Afghanistan. And we ended up having to get him to say he was working for another network and not the actual French network, because at the end of the day, the bounty on any particular journalist was quite high. The French were paying kind of ransoms at the time. And he survived that particular kind of session. I interviewed him. I actually got the thing on camera because the journalists, and I say we, and the actual networks themselves in Afghanistan all went to close the story down because he was about to be executed. Okay. And it was a very, very brave move. And it was an incredible move that AFP did with a number of networks anyway, to make sure that that guy actually, he had to tell a bit of a furphy, okay, to get himself out of the trouble. But it worked, and we managed to get him out, and we debriefed him, and he was so grateful, because they were literally lining him up ready to execute him, because of something that Taliban had said as well. Yeah. So these things do work, and I think at the end of the day, it's tactics that get you by. But again, it's the network that's behind you, exactly, on that particular point, ready to save the day. From that point of view. Yeah.
Perhaps on the social media topic, yes, please.
Sorry, I'm very interested to find out from Nicole and also Rami. When I was there a couple of weeks ago, one of the local journalists was telling me that he thought that Hamas had its day. It's an interesting comment, this, and that at the end of the day, the youth of Hamas were starting to come forward a lot more quicker, and they were getting disenfranchised with kind of Mahmoud Abbas and some of the actual group there. And he felt that they were waiting for something to happen to Mahmoud Abbas in a couple of years to step down for Hamas to actually be a lot more kind of stronger. But this took me by surprise when Hamas obviously went in and did this particular kind of attack. I'm interested to find out really what Rami and also Nicole think the current state of play is, because what I was told when I was there is the people to watch out for were the kind of the Islamic Jihad. That they're more kind of radical, they go to the death on these things, and that was what was exactly explained to me by some of the regional journalists. The last bullet, literally in the chamber, they will fire it. But what they were saying at the time was that Hamas had become a bit weaker. But I'm keen to find out what you think, being on the ground.
From what I've seen and learned so far, Tony, it seems that, well, to the Palestinian Authority in Mahmoud Abbas, the word that came up in my mind when you asked that question is corrupt. And so many people have been saying that when Mahmoud Abbas's name comes up, people say, oh, corrupt. From what I've seen, he and the PA have lost the hearts and minds of a majority of the people. In the West Bank, as our experts here know, only about 40% of the West Bank is actually controlled by the Palestinian Authority now. But in the Gaza Strip, for folks who aren't aware, Gaza is now controlled through elections a long time ago, and more should have been done in the time since, but Hamas controls that. I believe that Hamas, at least in the Gaza Strip, has won the hearts and minds of the people there, a majority of the people there, and they continue to do, because while the PA and Mahmoud Abbas is being considered as impotent, or maybe, it's all relative, but maybe moderate, again, relative, that at least Hamas is doing something and pushing back, and Abbas and his people are seen as someone distant and physically, separated across Israel because of that. In terms of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, what you said appears, is what I'm seeing, in that they're even more hardcore, if you will, and willing to put it all out there. But they are the second biggest militant group in Gaza. So I don't know if they will be weakened. I don't know if anyone will. I think the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and Benjamin Netanyahu, they've said they want to destroy Hamas. The question is, how can you destroy an ideology? Because it is just as much the physical buildings and really the tunnels, the 300 miles of tunnels I talked about before. Sure, you can bomb what you can see, you can flood or seal the tunnels, but I'm not the first to have said this, but I'll just raise it again. When one person is killed, more passions, more biases, more hate is spawned, and those people can then carry on where others have died, and more people. So when we see one death, a man or a woman wrapped up in a cloth that's bloodied, that we've seen in agencies, the people around them, their sons, their daughters, there is first a sadness, then an anger, then a hate that could potentially inspire them to take up arms and then to be, to carry on.
And are you seeing, another crazy question really, but are you seeing any, I mean, Hezbollah, 2004, I was actually over in Lebanon, and I saw the Israelis with testing some of their weapons out to actually suck out the front of buildings and so on and so forth, kind of bizarre stuff where they wanted to see inside the building for Hezbollah's kind of stronghold. But are you seeing anything like that where new weapons are appearing from the Israelis' point of view on the ground?
No, that's quite novel to me. Sucking out buildings, like
they would actually detonate something
to take a building's facade off.
Yeah, what had happened? It was an airburst munition that they developed, and what had happened is that as it exploded, it would pull out the front of the building, so their intelligence team could see inside. And that was happening. That was a real radical thing that I talked about with John Simpson and Jeremy Bowen at the time. But I'm just wondering whether it's Israel, because of the bunkers as well. Yeah.
Right. So I haven't seen that, and I haven't seen any reporting on that, but I'll look into that. What we have seen is something called the iron beam. It's basically a laser. And this is a bit of an evolution from what we know as the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome, for those who don't know, is basically a mobile interceptor network here, where there are mobile batteries all around Israel. They're made up of 3 components. The first component is basically a radar, and the second is like a computing machine that can triangulate the angle of a rocket coming into Israel. And if it triangulates that a rocket, a missile, is going to hit a populated area, say Tel Aviv, then the third component will then fire an interceptor missile to explode near the incoming missile. So off of that, which is very effective, by the way, 95% is what would be understood to be the efficiency. The Iron Beam has just been rolled out in terms of a trial operation, where while the Iron Dome missile one estimates 40 to 50,000 bucks, a single laser shot could be on the order of maybe $1 to $5. So it's much more efficient, much more effective. The IDF has actually also said, though, that while they're trialing it in the south, they're not rolling it out officially. I think the years until 2025. With that said, I mean, they're trialing it. So I've also learned, and I think we all know, and Nicole especially, that organizations here may say one thing and then they may do another.
Yeah, thank you.
Just on the point of Hamas, I think it is a really interesting point and question. How much support do they have? Had they had their day as such? And while, it's a long time since I lived in Gaza permanently, up until COVID, I would still go back there most years, and I'm in contact with people there pretty often. I don't know that the majority of people in Gaza support Hamas. I haven't seen any recent polling to that. I think some of the articles that I read that did have polling over the last couple of years, it was anywhere from, let's say, 20% to 50% max. I mean, the people that I speak to, they're journalists, they have never said, the majority of people in Gaza support Hamas. Now, obviously, they did win free and fair elections back in the day. It was a protest vote against the utter failure of the peace process, the ongoing disastrous situation of their lives. But I don't think that the majority of people in Gaza support Hamas. I don't think we really know. It's always interesting after a war to see what people have to say. And even now, and on air, we're constantly hearing presenters say to Palestinians, well, what do you think of what Hamas did in Israel? And then, we've probably all heard this debate, and then the Palestinians sometimes turn it around and say, well, you don't ask that question to the Israelis. What do you think of what the IDF is doing in Gaza? So I think for the Palestinians in Gaza, the one thing that is on their mind when it's not a war, on their mind being a euphemism really, is the ongoing blockade and siege. And I think in in the current media environment, we almost get this sense that this closure of Gaza and this sort of heavy blockade of fuel, food, and electricity is something that just happened. Now, we know that that's not the case, but I think if you're completely new to this story and you're coming in, it is very confusing. And I think we can forget that even under normal circumstances, people in Gaza, for example, are only getting 4 to 8 hours of electricity a day. I mean, you know, Israel constantly says, well, we no longer have forces or settlers inside Gaza. We don't control Gaza. Well, we know that they do control the borders, the air and the sea, and that is an occupation. And under international law, an occupying force does have the responsibility for the people there. You know, we're hearing from the IDF that the third phase of this entire Gaza operation, well, let's wait and see, may be the complete severing of, or continued severing of all ties with Gaza. Anyhow, I think the bottom line is it's beholden upon us. And I know that places like, you know, AFP, of course, and other organizations are doing it, but it is difficult, perhaps, to remember to put it in context. And as Antonio Guterres said, you know, this hasn't happened in isolation. It's not just a reaction or a response to the events of October 7. You know, a lot of analysts, let's say, was listening to a foreign affairs podcast the other day. I mean, they've been as we know, you know, the West Bank has been hot for a long time, and they had been warning, I think even, I don't know if you were saying that, Tony, that the conditions were ripe for things to explode. So as one of my Palestinian friends, Sammy, said, he's a journalist, you know, this is also a reaction to the extreme pressure that people are under in Gaza, blockaded, under siege for 17 years, no hope, no jobs, no future. And here we are. So, I mean, we are starting to see over the last 2 weeks a lot more reporting on the situation in the West Bank, which I think has helped to provide context for people. And I think that is something that we obviously all need to keep trying to do, because otherwise it sounds like this is just an Israel-Gaza thing, and what else is going on? Well, as we know, there's a lot. So
just interesting.
I think just one question. Sorry, just one question. How important Eric, I know you wanted to say something as well about the hostage coverage, and I wanted to ask you all, and Tony, please follow on with your comments before that as well, before we run out of time. Context, Nicole, you were saying, is very important when covering this as well. So people with experience can provide a lot of added value with the context of the conflict. Verification, before we also finish how difficult is it being to verify? And we were speaking about social media, about posting or not, but social media is also playing a big role, because sources are using social media that brings in a storm of information that sometimes in newsrooms it's difficult to verify. So these things, and then please, Tony, Eric, whoever wants to start first.
I pass that one to Eric.
Okay, well, I mean, X is just this toxic swamp of disinformation and fake stuff. I mean,
you have to attribute that, Eric. I think you have to quote someone else saying that.
Yes.
Or is that a fact?
No, I'm quoting the New York Times. No, I think I'm quoting an AFP story we put out 2 days ago. I think the word toxic featured in it. I mean, it's just, I mean, if I look at my For You, I mean, and the problem is once the trust goes as well, because before you did get fake stuff, but, you know, most of it was fairly verified, and, you know, they had their moderating system that wasn't too bad. But nowadays, I mean, I think one thing that struck me, so X, unlike the role, as everybody said, it played in the 2011 Arab Spring, is not proving to be not only not a reliable source of information, but there's a lot of disinformation on it. One thing that struck me, though, was looking at it is most of the disinformation you're seeing is just the classic recycled videos from other conflicts. I'm not seeing a lot. I mean, I saw there was a post yesterday. I saw a couple of examples of of images generated by artificial intelligence. But I mean, I think it's just old school disinformation and fake news. Images from Ukraine, images from Aleppo, claiming to be images from Gaza or Israel, whatever. But it's a problem. I mean, what used to be a good source of information is now very problematic. You know, I don't know what everybody else has experienced.
Yeah, I mean, looking at unmuted. Yeah, there we are. Looking through my Twitter feed now, it's much harder to surface news, and what I'm getting is it takes time. And you know, when we're reporting, when we have deadlines, it takes up time that we already don't have or are limited. Thankfully, I've just pulled up my CBS Slack channel here. Thankfully, we have someone who is looking and trying to source these videos here, and we have like an Israel-Palestine like video Slack channel. Those are not verified in and of themselves, but they're being flagged. And then if we want to use something, then we send that to New York and we say, hey, can you help verify this? Sometimes they can be verified, sometimes they can't, and then we don't use them. But we never put anything out that isn't verified by CBS News or our partner at the BBC. But yeah, social media. I think, Nicole, you said this, but just to stress, don't put any of your personal opinions on it and the facts. I'm very, very nervous about putting things out. So while I had, if you know me from my coverage of the Hong Kong protests, you knew that I was tweeting every few minutes. Here, I probably tweet once a day just because I want to make sure that I don't get in hot water by a person or an entity any which way around us. Oh, Paloma, you are muted.
There we go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Tony, you had something to say before, sorry. You are also muted.
You did,
I just, while he's muted, I just posted an AFP story actually about Twitter versus X, and
thank you.
Yeah, which kind of reflect kind of what I based that. I can attribute what I said to that story.
I think the thing is, in this situation, if you're AFP and you clearly have people on the ground, staff who you trust, who you know will give you information that is the right information. Same if you're an AP or a Reuters, Jazeera with its people permanently based there, the people that I call and get information from. And often it's to get, those human stories. And then like everyone else, it'll be, well, Palestinian authorities say, this many people, this is what a doctor says. But in the end, the way I do it is I just call and rely on the people that I know there and I trust there. And so I'm actually not having to deal with social media at all. And I think perhaps that's the luxury of either already have pre-existing contacts there or working for an organization that has people on the ground and has maintained the staff there. Because I think over the years, different networks have had people in Gaza on retainers or on sort of various staffing arrangements, but then started to reduce the numbers of staff, cutbacks, etc., and sort of thinking it wasn't a story. It didn't need to have someone permanently there. And then there's a scramble when something like this happens. Yeah, so that's my thoughts on that.
I think we're moving to some questions from the audience, right? Lawrence?
You can start, Florence, for your questions.
It's okay, right?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I wanted to just share my enormous concern, even though I have never covered Middle East. I happened to visit it there and have friends on both sides. Actually, when it happened, we had Israeli friend with us, and I was on Twitter. I mean, not on Twitter, on Signal with Palestinian friends. So I really had the two narratives, and I find that this is the major problem that we have with this situation, because the two narratives are almost irreconcilable. And what you are saying, Nicole, I mean, from the Palestinian side and network, you hear stories, including of the 7th October, which are very different. They tell you that there has been quite a few dead, possibly dozens of dead among the hostages by the IDF. There was this incredible live radio interview by a woman who was released. And the guy who was interviewing her could not believe it, because he kept saying, so are you saying that that all the dead you've seen on the lawn when you came out, where she was hostage with 45 people, and she explained that she's been taken as a shield in agreement with the hostage taker, and then when she came out, she understands that everyone else has been killed, and later on they killed all the other ones. And the guy who is interviewing her on the Israeli radio is very embarrassed, and he's saying, well, are you meaning that it's our people who may have? And she says, undoubtedly. Okay, so, and then I was showing these videos or this audio to my Israeli friend, and I was saying, what do you think of this? Is this genuine? I mean, and he was saying, well, this is actually on an Israeli network, and yes, there is no reason. It sounded genuine. That kind of narrative, it's not a narrative. They are facts. They are just events or, facts that we simply do not get in the Western media, as if it was taboo to say some things that are not consistent with the fact that the whole horror started on the 7th of October. And this is another thing which I find shocking, is that everyone seemed to feel obliged to start by, as you said, we discussed that a little bit before, we all have to say 7th October, brutal, horrendous, inhumane, etc. The real thing is that the massive monumental injustice that has been going and happening every day in this, in Gaza and in the Western for decades was never really highlighted. And why is it that we don't use the strong words indeed as brutal, inhumane, unspeakable, atrocious, which is to describe what has been happening for a very long time? The cons, the settlers arriving and simply pushing people out of their house over and over again, out of their land, with the backing of the army. These are things that people don't seem to know, and they seem to start on the 7th of October, and I find this very problematic. The other thing I saw, so basically not enough background, not enough understanding that if it has happened, it's not just because these people are terrorists. The real question is, why are they terrorists, right? So, there is much more I would like to contribute, but I really wanted to say how problematic I find this double narrative, especially when you hear it from both sides. And at the very beginning, so when I was in that situation with an Israeli friend at home, he lives in Tel Aviv, but he was traveling in China. And then it was the beginning, and both sides seemed to be able to talk. Now it's already finished. Now it's,
Can I pick up on that point? I think that's a really valid point. My exposure a couple of weeks ago was interesting, because there were 3 incidents that happened to me where at the end of the day, the Palestinian kind of voice didn't matter. Okay, there was one journalist who was coming back from a story, and he didn't realize this until he got home. And I said to him, "What's going on?" And he said, "Come and look at this." And he showed me that he'd gone through a crossing, okay, just south of Nablus. And as he'd gone through the crossing, they'd written on the back of his car in dust, "You are next, we're targeting you." Okay, and that really freaked him out, because at the end of the day, he went back to his family. His family knew that the car was coming back to them. And then we ended up with a situation where it was explained to me that the settlers have now got their own private highways to keep the Palestinians separate from the actual kind of the Jewish settlers themselves. And also on top of that, we saw obviously the actual destruction of some of the olive groves, which not many people know about. So it isn't surprising to me that the locals themselves have had enough. And then what's happened is Hamas have taken the lead, sadly, on this one particular principle. So I do hear what you're saying, and I experienced it firsthand a couple of weeks ago.
I mean, Florence, I mean, picking up from what you said, I mean, every single day AFP has been reporting from the West Bank and the attacks by the settlers on the raids. And do you ever see it picked up in the newspapers? I mean, how many people are aware of I don't know, was it Paul or Ami said that it's been boiling up in the West Bank for a long time now. There's lots of deaths daily on a daily basis. But of course, everybody just suddenly discovers the story on October the 7th, which was unprecedented event in the history of Israel since the Holocaust, as everybody says. So, I mean, you know, obviously the clock started there, but there's a lot of people weigh in with opinions who actually don't know the history. You know, and if you know, if you don't understand, if you don't know your history, you can't understand what's happening.
And
but of course, the danger, Florence, also is that anybody who puts it in context can be seen as justifying what happened on October 7th, which nobody can do. So the debate gets stifled too, you know.
Even if you can't, you can't justify it, but you can explain it to some extent, I find, because once people understand the scale of injustice is the breed for any terrorism in most cases, unless it's simply brainwashing, right? But in most cases, it's injustice. Once you, and indeed, you may seem to then give them reason for doing what they do, but there were reasons for doing what they do. You know, it's not just out of pure evil that all these kids or older people or young decided to do this massacre. And on the history of, on the point of background and history, etc., I was very surprised. I was just checking a few things because I've studied a little bit during my university years, the Middle East. And I saw that even on Wikipedia, the way things are explained are quite problematic. It's actually, there are some important moments that are lacking. And I was like, oh, wow. If some people want to check by Wikipedia, which is your first, go-to page, you won't
No, it's not. No. Wikipedia is not your first go-to page, Florence.
I agree.
Go to Wikipedia.
No, of course not for us, but for many people. Yeah. But for many people who are like, oh, it seems complicated. Let me try and work it out, right? And actually, when you see what you see there, you won't be satisfied with it. Yeah. And just one more point. I'm sorry.
Excuse me. Sorry, Florence. Because we are running out of time, and there are more questions to be asked from the audience. If sorry, thank you so much. May I read the other question? I'm not sure if the person who is asking is there to ask, but I will just read it. Julian Chan is asking, how responsible do war correspondents and news organizations feel about de-escalating conflict by reporting from both sides of a story in a single report?
I'll just take that very quickly. It's absolutely important to include both sides of a story in a single report every single time, especially in this conflict, I believe, because as we were saying, if you say just do one side, then you open yourself up also to criticism and controversy. So I'll just leave it at that in the interest of time, but let other people chime in.
Please.
I mean,
more comments, Eric?
I mean, your job is to report the facts, not escalate or de-escalate. But I am quite impressed by how many reports keep talking about this conflict. What's the word? I'm searching for the word. Expanding and becoming a regional war. Oh, and sometimes when I read these stories, it's almost as if the journalist is willing that Hezbollah and Lebanon gets involved and the Iranians get involved. So, I mean, as if this conflict wasn't just enough to focus on, But, I mean, get both sides, but I don't, you just have to report facts. There was just one thing I'd ask Paloma if I could mention it, which is off what we've been talking about, but it's something just from a purely journalistic aspect, is how do you cover the hostages? And how do you cover the videos? Okay. So our approach, and I'd be interested what colleagues think, AFP, it's almost a bit like prisoners of war, different but similar. It is a sign of life, proof of life. If a photo or a video is released of a hostage. So our rule, and I don't know how it applies to other news organizations, our rule is, and we applied that, for example, the ISIS videos, is we will take a still image capture from the video. We don't show the video and we don't quote the person who is speaking under duress, and that's how we publish it. And we also try to show a picture of the person in their normal life. So they're not just the hostage person, they're also, you can see them as they are. And we don't publish an image of a hostage if it's degrading, humiliating, if they're obviously wounded or whatever. So we will publish an image. We did it with the women who the video was released, not the lady that was released, the elderly lady that was released last week, but there was a younger woman. There was a video of her, came out 10 days or so ago, the first video of a hostage. So we did a grab her picture. She looked fairly normal in it, but we didn't quote her and we didn't show any video. So, which is, I think it's pretty good rule. Similar in prisoners of war. I mean, it falls under the Geneva Conventions, but it is proof of life as long as it's not degrading. And the ICRC in Geneva, who I speak to quite often about these things, do say that you can publish these images. It is proof of life, and it also puts the onus on the hostage taker or the person who is the prisoner of war. It also shows that these people are alive, and that it puts the responsibility on whoever's captors are to keep them alive. But I'd be interested to see what other people think about use of hostage videos.
Yes, I think we are, Jay, we are running out of time, right? I also know that some of you may have to go and leave. So final comments, Nicole, if you have to leave, say you want to say something before anybody else, and then I guess we are just we will have to close the session.
Yeah, I have to go. It's been wonderful speaking to you all, and a real honor to be on a panel with all of you. I'm sure we could all continue to talk for much longer. I'm not really sure what my final comments are. I guess, you know, having lived inside Gaza and spent a lot of time there, I as I said before, I think the most important thing is going forward for this war, for however long it continues, that we just keep trying to get those voices out. It's going to be increasingly difficult to do so. And as we're all trying to do, humanize the people who are living there and going through extraordinary circumstances. And as we've just heard, you know, continue to provide that, where possible, background and nuance to do more than just say this happened, that happened, but to try and educate people about some of the origins of this conflict. And that's why, you know, I think both print and television that have done an online breakout pieces on different elements of it have been really useful and seem to have been picked up a lot by viewers and audience and readers. And I think that's sort of as much as we can do until people can actually get on the ground inside Gaza and see what has really happened.
Thank you, Nicole. Please, Rami, Tony, Eric, your final comments if you want to share something. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to fly, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Take care.
Bye.
I just got... Sorry, Rami, you go.
No, I'll just say, coming into this with fresh eyes and a fresh perspective, you got to do your homework, you got to do your research, and there's never enough research to be done. Because if you mess up, then the people who have been following this, and there are countless people, hundreds of thousands, millions of people are following, they will know. So make sure you do your research, talk to as many people on the ground, like what Nicole was just sharing with us, both Israel and in Gaza. She's already drilled home the point that it's tough to get information, first-person information out of Gaza. Thankfully, we have our own CBS News producer on the ground in there who's been telling us things. And also say that, yeah, from covering the protests in Hong Kong to Ukraine to here, personally, for me, it's the most intense conflict that I've done. So I'll just add, as a fairly new dad, live for your job, don't die for your job. But I think this is probably the least safe that I've been in my life being a journalist. With that said, I have been and will continue to be, and I'm sure everyone here will continue to be, an advocate for international news. It is exciting, but again, get home safely.
Rami, thank you, and take care of yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, you'll see my reporting from the border later on today.
Thank you, Rami.
Bye.
Stay safe. Thank you.
Just to reiterate,
Tony, Eric.
Yeah, just a quick one on the point that Rami said there. It's interesting. My old boss, Chris Kramer, former kind of head of CNN as well, said no story's worth a life. Okay, that was the big thing really from his perspective, and he was the big advocate for really kind of looking at news safety. We're now moving into a different area, and Israel is dominant. There's no two ways about that, and it should be as well. But what we're moving into 2024 are election year for a lot of countries, where public order, demonstrations, civil action as well are going to be absolutely huge. We're in Bangladesh right now. We're in Pakistan. I'm going into Washington next week, actually, to start looking at what's going to happen 2024. And I think that's another area of risk that journalists need to start to think about as well. But Gaza stays front and center without a shadow of a doubt.
I would just say that you should follow this by reading reliable sources. Don't just jump on any random post on social media from somebody you've never heard of. Look at reliable sources and look at different sources. Look at Israeli media. Times of Israel is not behind a paywall from what I can see. I mean, when I get up in the morning, I watch CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. I mean, Al Jazeera is essential out of Gaza. And it's a professional outfit. I mean, as I said at the start of the conversation, AFP, AP, Reuters, and Al Jazeera were all together when they were shelled in Lebanon. So it's a serious news operation with, obviously, an Arab perspective, which is good. So just follow it from a diverse range of reliable sources. And be very careful what you post on social media, you know. And buy Tony's book, Zero Risk. Right, Tony?
It's good. It's a good read. Yeah.
And it broke my heart because when it starts with Sardar Ahmed being killed, right? It's not Shamarai. He began the book with a story about my colleague who was shot with his family in hotel in Kabul. But it's a great journey, and it's also shows how much of a contribution Tony made to journalist safety. I mean, he really revolutionized it. Before if you survived it, great, you know, you'll learn for the next one. But Tony saved a lot of lives of all journalists, including at AFP.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And look, it's been a journey for me. It's literally 20 years, 30 years of my life really dedicated to this. But I've always been an advocate for the regional journalist, the person that's in the field that makes the risks on a daily basis. And we know for a fact we've made a difference. And certainly with your help, Eric, as well, with the support of AFP, we've gone a long way from just sending people out with nothing and putting people at better protection now and better informed as well, which is really good.
Yep. And thanks, Paloma.
Thanks, Paloma.
Thank you. Well, we have reliable sources, safety, and bring the voices out of Gaza and Israel. So thank you so much, everyone, for your participation and very, very important insights. My pleasure to moderate this panel. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Stay safe. Stay safe.
Take care. Stay safe. Bye. The best.